Hi, Glenn.
All right.
How are you?
Oh, hi there, Josh. Fine, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. I always feel the need to comment on the fact that I'm sitting here on the Stanford campus. It's a beautiful blue sky, sunny day, but we are in the shadow of the dark tower. That's the Hoover Institution Tower. As I look out over my right shoulder, there it is.
I'd say the environmental amenities compensate for the political disamenities.
I have to agree with you about that. So, Glenn, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. I've been on a few times. This is your first time. Probably everybody knows who you are, but let me formally introduce you as the something Myron Stoltz professor.
Merton Stoltz.
Okay, Merton Stoltz professor at Brown University, an economist, and I'll say a very thoughtful, interesting, wide-ranging one, and a nice guy.
Well, that's nice. Thank you.
Just a personal opinion, but based on some experience.
It's not universally shared, but I appreciate it nonetheless.
And among other things, not your greatest distinction, but it is a source of some distinction. Recent contributor to Boston Review. I talked with your article on Blogging Heads TV about a week or so ago with Brink Lindsay, my friend at Cato Institute. I never thought that the phrase "my friend at Cato Institute" would be crossing my lips, but Brink is a terrific person, interesting and thoughtful guy. Your article, I should say, yesterday was written up. This is in a blog called In the News, Forensic Psychology, Criminology, and Psychology-Law. This is by Karen Franklin, and she says about it, she describes it as an insightful report. I didn't think of it as a report. It's an essay. But she does say yesterday that it's the talk of the blogosphere this week, and it's about why so many Americans are in prison, and we'll get to that. I was actually thinking a lot about your article a few weeks ago. I was called for jury duty in San Francisco, where I live, and it was a terrible case, and I was eventually excused. They never questioned me, though I did sit through 3 days of voir dire and listen to a very intense series of discussions between the lawyers and the judge and potential jurors. It was a case of a young African-American guy, early 20s, accused of killing an Asian-American woman and shooting her friend, partner in the eye during a drug deal gone bad. So, terrible case. For me, one of the most terrible things about it was that the kid who was accused, 22 years old, really looked a lot like a very good friend of my 21-year-old son, who the friend himself happens to be serving some time now for cocaine possession and with intent to sell. So it was not a happy experience. The reason I was thinking of you, though, was that a lot of the issues that you discuss in your article about race and imprisonment and drugs were very much the issues during the discussion. So, for example, one potential juror being questioned said, look, too many people, and in particular, too many young African-American men are in prison already. And in essence, he said, I don't care what the evidence is. I don't care if you can prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. I would have real trouble signing a guilty verdict. Now, this was somebody who obviously didn't want to be on the jury, and the judge eventually dismissed him. But there were a number of other people who said, there were a few things that were said. One was there's excessive incarceration. A second thing some people said was, I don't trust any cops, and some of them got off depending on how little trust they had. There were a number of Asian Americans who said, I think African Americans pick on Asians. so I'm going to be biased in this case. And it being San Francisco, there were lots of people who said, I think gun violence is really bad, and I'm going to be, the fact that this guy had illegally possessed a handgun meant I'm not going to be a fair juror in this case. But it was that comment by the guy who said, too many people in prison already. I'm not going to be complicit in adding to the prison population. And I was wondering I'm sitting there thinking, what would Glenn say here? I thought I knew what you would say, but I was wondering,
well, you know, the reaction is understandable at a certain level, but also very troubling, isn't it? I mean, if individuals in their exercise of the duties of citizenship are unable to enter into a kind of impartial, assessment, deliberation, or whatever, out of their sort of political protest against the, macro environment. I mean, in an individual case, a particular person who might happen to be black who does, let's say, some heinous thing, if that's what the evidence shows, it seems like a African-American citizen ought to be able to sit in a deliberation about that and make a judgment about that as a citizen, quite independently of that person's feelings about whether or not they think our social policy and criminal justice policy is appropriate. But of course, that's not we don't live in that perfect world. So it is troubling, and maybe not too surprising that this kind of identity dynamic would go on, and that a sense of alienation, distrust. We hear about people advocating not to snitch when they've observed criminal offending, even though making that information available to the authorities might preserve their own lives and make their communities safer and more livable. But still, they somehow are identifying with or see their identities in some way or another tied up with being in opposition to the system. So it seems to me that's one of the detrimental consequences of us getting so far down this road of the scale of our punishment apparatus having grown so great, and the disparity of the way in which it engages with different communities. So people in urban, minority, low-income communities are feeling themselves on the outside of it.
Yeah. Interesting fact is, maybe I misspoke or you misheard, but in fact, the guy who said this was not himself African American.
Oh no, I just assumed.
Yeah,
see, that's
there we are. It's a part of our topic. No, it's this was. I probably have said more than I should have said already about the nature of the conversation, but I'll just say, without saying what community he did belong to, what his ethnicity was, he was not African American. The fact is, I should say that there were a number of people who didn't express such an unwillingness to sign a guilty verdict. This was not a death penalty case, by the way. There are a number of people who said that if the case was shown beyond a reasonable doubt, they would be prepared to sign a guilty verdict. The judge wouldn't dismiss those people, but the prosecutor dismissed those people when they had said at some point in the course of the conversation that they were concerned about excessive incarceration of African Americans. So if you said, as I did say on my questionnaire, I was never questioned. I just sat in the audience for 3 days. I said there's a question on a written questionnaire, and they ask you, do you think that African Americans commit more crimes than other groups? And I said, certainly that they're incarcerated more. Don't really know if they commit more crimes. Maybe they do, but incarcerated more. And other people said the same thing. And everybody who said that while they were being questioned was dismissed by under a peremptory challenge by the prosecutor.
You mean everyone who did not say, yes, to that question.
So if you get up and you say, I'm prepared to sign a guilty verdict if you show me beyond a reasonable doubt that this guy did this thing. You know,
Yes.
I don't care that he's, you know, black, white, whatever. You show me beyond a reasonable doubt, I'm prepared to sign it. But if you also said, I think that there's a problem about excessive incarceration of African Americans.
You were dismissed by the prosecution.
Dismissed by the prosecution, yeah. Just as everybody who said, I think African Americans pick on Asians, but I'd be prepared to sign I think I can be a fair juror, they would be dismissed by the defense attorney. So it was a difficult situation in which it was hard to say what you thought. I mean, I thought if Glenn Loury were sitting here and answered the questions honestly in terms of issues about incarceration and concerns about that, but said, look, if he killed somebody, he's responsible for it, and I'm going to sign a guilty verdict if you show me beyond reasonable doubt, you would have been tossed from the jury by the prosecutor.
For expressing the view that I thought at a macro level there were too many young black men in prison.
That's correct. That was the pattern in the that was the pattern in the discussion.
Well, it may be that the prosecutors, in the prosecutor's experience, people who have that political view are, someone that's done a study finding them less likely to vote to convict, other things equal.
Right.
But it does raise the question of where, if not in a courtroom when a particular case is being heard, where ought there to enter into our, public deliberations about crime and punishment, precisely this consideration that, it's really devastating particular demographic groups. It's falling too hard on particular population segments. This is not the way we want to, as a country, relate to disadvantaged minority males. I mean, where can you say that? If you can't say that, arguably, you can't say it in a specific trial of a particular person. You don't acquit, O.J. Simpson because you think, the L.A. police are racist in general. Somehow that doesn't seem to be the right thing to do, but we ought to be able to have a conversation about race and punishment.
Well, that was what your Boston Review piece was trying to hit off, and maybe we should talk about that a little bit. So why don't you just remind people? I think people know, in general terms, but remind what do we call them? Viewers, listeners, blogging headsers, whatever. What are some of the basic dimensions, the scope and scale of imprisonment, and in particular the kind of racialization of imprisonment in the United States?
Yeah, well, this has been going on for some time. It's been going on, 30 years, a massive transformation of American social policy on the criminal justice side. For most of the 20th century in the United States, our incarceration rate, numbers of people in jail and prison per 100,000 in the population, was around 100, 120 per 100,000, and in this it was not so much different than other industrial democratic countries in Northern Europe or Canada and whatever, and also hadn't changed much over time. It had been like this throughout the 20th century. Then we get to the early 1970s, and a real shift in policy takes place, and since then, prison populations have been growing in our country at an exponential rate. I mean, we're quintupled the number of people under lock and key since the early 1970s, quadrupled since 1980. We're now the premier jailer on the globe. We incarcerate about 730 people per 100,000 in the population. Mm-hmm. And that's higher than any other country. It's higher by a factor of 5, 6, or 7 if you compare us to Germany or France, or 12 times higher than Japan.
And the story that you tell in the article in the review is that this huge increase in incarceration is best explained in terms of a shift in a direction of a kind of a collective decision this is not just by political officials or certainly by jailers or police, but it's a decision by the American people through the political system in the direction of more punitiveness.
That's right. And, it's a complicated story. It involves institutions across the board, the federal government, state and local authorities. It involves the media. It involves the larger culture, the cult of the victim, if you will, the way that we react to particular heinous events, and how our political process works, and how people run for office, and how candidates can be discredited to the extent that they can be depicted soft or unwilling to do with criminals what ought to be
coddling
done.
Criminals, that was the...
Coddling criminals. And, you can trace this back to the 60s, to reactions to the New Left and the radicalism of the anti-war and the civil rights, and the conservative swing in politics. And, this has been much discussed and written about in the history and political science literatures, and the campaigns of George Wallace and Richard Nixon for president, and on through Ronald Reagan's presidency and so forth. But I don't want to make it too much of a partisan issue because, of course, Democrats as well as Republican politicians have been running for office promising voters to keep them safe from criminals and so on. One could tell, a long and complex story. But yes, my central point that you stress is that this is a collective decision that we have made.
Yeah.
We've gone from a situation where roughly half of the complaints to police of a criminal victimization result in some arrest. And in the early 1970s, as late as 1980, the probability that a person arrested would go to jail, would go to prison as a consequence of that arrest was about 13%. Mm-hmm. And it's up to 28% now. It's increased by more than doubling. The chance that a person would go to jail, we send them to jail for longer periods of time. We're less likely to allow them out for parole. We're much more likely than at times in our past to return people to jail for technical violations while they were on parole. We've had a huge explosion of the number of people in prison for nonviolent offenses. 2/3 of the people in state prisons are in there for nonviolent, for drug or property-related offenses, and the number of people under lock and key for drug offenses has gone up 11-fold since 1980, with just a total transformation of policy associated with our
I spent 3 months on a grand jury 6 years ago in Massachusetts, and the way Massachusetts works is that every felony has to be indicted by a grand jury. So what you do when you sit on the grand jury for 3 months is you just hear case after case after case. So we heard 150 cases. We indicted 750 people. Again, I'm probably saying things that I shouldn't be saying, but we actually had a fairly high rate of rejection of proposed indictments. We rejected 1.5% of the indictments that came before us. And I say that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, although I have to say, as foreman of the grand jury, I was probably one of the least predisposed to indict, and my own rejection rate, if I had been making the decisions by myself, might have been 3% or something like that. So most of the cases, this is a probable cause, this is an indictment, it's not a conviction, the standards are much lower, hearsay evidence is permissible, and there's no defense presented. It's just, a little bit of a check on the assistant district attorneys, and my sense is that the big check on the assistant district attorneys is these are young people, they don't want to get in trouble and lose their job, so they don't bring cases unless they think they're very, very likely to be indicted. So it's one of these situations where you don't expect there to be a very high turn-down rate because they are very, very unhappy and worried that they're going to get fired if they start getting proposed indictments rejected. So just on the drug point, the reason I mention this is because I don't remember what percentage of the cases were drug cases, but it was a very, very substantial number were possession with intent to distribute. We also heard some truly horrific cases, the worst things I'd ever heard in my life, but a large number of the cases were possession with intent to sell. So, but going back to, suppose, playing devil's advocate here, you say there's been this big increase in incarceration. The chances of, and in particular, that the chances of being sent to jail if you're arrested have gone from 13% to 28%. I could imagine, not me maybe, but this is devil's advocate here, somebody sitting here thinking, gee, isn't that good news? What, people who are not letting people go free, who are doing bad stuff, we're putting, number one, they've done something wrong, they should suffer some punishment for it, number one, and number two, the crime rate has gone down a lot. Why isn't this a great success of social policy? Why say this is a bad collective decision to get more punitive?
Well, sure, people should be punished and should pay some cost for breaking the law, no doubt about that. I mean, that doesn't resolve the question of what cost, how much. I mean, it doesn't tell us how long we should keep people in prison and what should we do with them when they're in there and what should we do with them when they're out. So that still would leave open the issue of whether or not we were being too punitive. So I'm not at all arguing that people should be, given a pass. But I do want to talk about this in a critical way as perhaps not being the smartest social policy on the issue of whether the benefit of reducing crime justifies the upscaling of our punishment regime. I don't think the evidence bears out the claim that the fall in crime is a beneficial consequence of that. That is, when the statisticians and economists have tried to identify the causal effect of greater incarceration on criminal offending, they come up with numbers that aren't big enough to account for the huge fall that we've seen in criminal offending since the early 1990s. I mean, crime rates are down 50% or more, depending on the category, the place, and such. But crime rates are down. Violent crime, property crime is down significantly. So you can't account. And just thinking about the large swings that we see in these kinds of statistical series. Over time, I mean, the rise of crime that we saw from the 1950s and early 1960s through the 1980s, there was a big historical upswing. People are hard-pressed to give an account for that. And likewise, many hypotheses are out there having to do with the economy, changes in culture and attitude, changes in our demography, baby booms ebbing and flowing, and other such arguments. Frankly, I don't know. Policing techniques also have undergone a lot of innovation and such. I don't know that anybody can say exactly why crime rates have fallen, but the evidence that the causal link between greater imprisonment and the reduction of crime is a strong one. That evidence is weak. About a quarter, most people think, the most that you can explain of the fall in crime since the early 90s. By reference to increased incarceration of about 25%.
And that's an outside limit.
That's an outside limit. Other people are much more conservative.
Yeah, it's the Bruce Western book, I think, puts it at about 10%. And it's also true that, everybody, I think everybody who was involved in any kind of crime reduction activity in the 90s thinks that they found the Philosopher's Stone, the great cure. So Giuliani thinks it's because he was, putting the arm on the squeegee men and throwing them in prison. And our friend Gene Rivers got himself on the cover of Newsweek because he had a strategy for dealing with crime in Boston, and different strategies in different places, but then there's this common pattern throughout the 90s of as you say, a very sharp decline in crime rates, and everybody's going to be taking credit for it, but
Exactly. Crime falls where you have preachers marching on the street and where you didn't. It falls where you have zero tolerance, don't let the squeegee men squeegee anybody's car window, and it falls where the local police departments didn't do that.
I haven't looked at the public opinion numbers on this, Glenn. Maybe you have. So, is this sharp? If you ask people now, is violent crime a big problem in your neighborhood, in your city? Is it less of a problem now than it used to be? Do you know what the opinion numbers look like on that?
I don't know what the official sort of good, clean, trustworthy national surveys of opinion would say. I have the impression from, for example, reading the work and listening to the lectures of your Stanford colleague in the sociology department, Lawrence Bobo, that there remains a high level of concern about anxiety, about sense that crime is a problem, but I would prefer to, just look it up than to guess about something like that.
I should say this was another thing that came up during the voir dire. There were a lot of people who expressed very serious concerns of different kinds about crime in San Francisco, about violent crime in San Francisco. And there was one point at which a calm, engaging, but slightly frustrated defense attorney said something like, well, I thought he was channeling Glenn Loury. He said something like, well, do you know what the crime numbers look like, and do you know how much the crime rate has declined? And I guess it made me think that there may really be a very serious lag in registering the very considerable decline that there's been. And my guess is that if you ask people, this is my guess, I'll make it a prediction and I'll look it up and see if I'm right. My guess is that if you ask people, what do you think are the big problems that the country faces, or that your city faces, or your state faces, that 20 years ago crime would have been pretty high on the list, and my guess is that it's significantly less high on the list now. But then if you ask people, if you compare surveys from 20 years ago with surveys now, my guess is that it's dropped a lot on the list. But that if you ask people, is crime a less serious problem now than it was 20 years ago, people are going to say, no, it isn't really a less serious problem. So they're not going to have registered. It hasn't registered yet that there really has been a significant decline in crime rates. But I can check that out. But one of the things that we haven't talked about in this piece of the conversation about punitiveness and incarceration is the race part of it. So you emphasize, we're talking about this, that there's a big collective shift in punitiveness that results in longer prison sentences, more people ending up in prison who are accused, and more, probably higher rate of recidivism, less of an emphasis on rehabilitation. So punitiveness is what's driving that. And so in your sense, where does race fit into the punitiveness picture?
Well, right, just at the descriptive level, the scale of incarceration is up. Our punitive index, if we had one, would be way up. And the incidence of this punitiveness, that is where it falls, that is who are the people who are subject to the police and to the incarceration, who are the lawbreakers who are in our jails and in our courtrooms, is very unequal racially. Now, a person might say, so what? A person says, we have the people who broke the law. Those are the people who they are. They belong to whatever groups they belong to, but their group is an irrelevancy. They're in this category because they've broken the law. Mm-hmm. And that's an argument. It's not an argument I agree with, and I'll come back to the point. But I just want to say, just at the descriptive level, just in terms of counting, are we talking a 7-to-1 or 8-to-1 ratio of the risk of incarceration if you're an African-American male to if you're a white male, other things being equal in terms of your class and so forth? We're talking, 1/3 or so of young black men in an American city will have some kind of relationship with law enforcement. We're talking for high school dropouts before the age of 35. Bruce Western estimated a nearly 60% likelihood that the person would have been imprisoned for a felony offense sometime before reaching the 35 year if they were born in the late 1960s, and if they're a black male who didn't finish high school. So these are so in communities where you have a concentration of poorly educated, low-income, minority, black and Latino males, the prison is the central prison, and the police are the central institution. They're the face of the public that these young people encounter. Now, they may have broken the law, and so they're being punished for it. On the other hand, they're also living in conditions. They are in a quarter of the society segregated away from the rest of us. They are interacting within their own peer groups. They're attending schools that are not functioning very well, their conditions of housing, healthcare, etc., the beneficial influences, the nurturing, developmental, positive influences in their lives may be minimal, both from the private sector and from public activity. They are behaving in ways that are not entirely a surprise to us, given the conditions that they're living in, and the racial disparity in this is, I think, and I try to argue in the piece, an evidence of the persisting hierarchical subordination. I mean, we can throw these words around. I'm basically saying it's a remnant of an unjust social order that continues to play itself out among us on a daily basis.
There's another piece of this, which and there are many different remnants, but one issue that people talk about some is so what you describe when you talk about the condition of the young African American men living in concentrated inner city poverty, bad housing, bad schools, et cetera, et cetera. There, it's the way that race plays a role is because it's associated, for understandable historical reasons, associated with class, essentially. I mean, with being in bad, poor, bad housing, health problems, education, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's an issue here, which is just the racial discrimination, racial categorization piece itself. And there was a recent paper, I'm sure you've read it, that spoke in a very powerful way to this. This is by two very thoughtful, interesting economists, Marianne Bertrand at University of Chicago and Sendhil Mullainathan, who a former colleague at MIT when I was at MIT and he was at MIT. I've moved to Stanford, he's moved to Harvard. So they had a very interesting idea. I'm sure you know the paper, and you correct me if I get some of it wrong. They did a field experiment. So what they did was they wrote up a bunch of resumes in terms of educational background and where you live and your previous job experience, et cetera, standard resumes. And then what they did was they had a bunch of names, some of which were, if you saw the name, you'd think white, and some of which, if you saw the name, you'd think very, very likely African American. Maybe a girl's name, Latonia, something like that. You think this is
right.
Okay. Jamal, not likely to be a white kid. So then what they did was they took these resumes, which didn't have any names attached to them, and then they randomly assigned names to them. So you take a resume, you put Jamal on it, or you take the resume and you put, Greg Smith on it. Yeah. And then they sent the resumes out they looked at the classifieds, and they sent the resumes out to apply for jobs. And so one of the things that they found was that if the resume had a recognizably African American name, Jamal, say, there was a 6.5% chance of getting a callback on the application. If they stuck the name, the white-sounding name, on it, Fred Stevenson or whatever, then there was about a 10% chance of getting a callback. So there was about a 50% increase in the chances of getting a callback that was accounted for by the name difference, and the names, again, signaled race. The thing that was most striking about this was they also checked to see how much difference it makes if you have additional job experience. So if you have 1 year additional job experience, your chances of getting called back were about 0.4 of a point higher. In other words, what that meant was that if you're white, you have a 50% greater chance, 6.5 to about 10% greater chance. It took so a black job applicant, it would take 8 additional years of work experience to be get the same chances of callback as a white job applicant. What was still more disturbing, and this goes to the issue that you were just raising about how it's kind of rational for people to act given their circumstances. So they looked at the question, how much difference does it make to your chances of getting called back that you're more qualified, you have a stronger resume? Stronger resume meaning more work experience, more education, better school. And what they found was that if you were white and your resume was stronger, it made a big difference to your getting called back. And if you were black and your resume was stronger, it made almost no difference to your getting called back. Okay, so here's the punchline. Imagine that you're a rational kid trying to decide what to invest time and energy in, and you think, I'm being told that having more job experience and more schooling and better schooling is going to make a difference to my ability to get ahead. You look at the results of this study, and the kid who says, hey, more school, I don't like to go to, but more school, more job experience, it's going to help me to get ahead. Bullshit. It's not really going to help me. What this study says is that kid is right. And so doesn't really make sense, to a certain kind of sense, to invest more in improving your profile if you're black, but it does make a difference if you're white.
Yeah, but I'd be cautious, Josh, not to over-interpret this. In that everything you've said, I believe, is an accurate report about what's found in the study, and it's an important study, and it's one of a number of studies that are emerging that I think are pretty compelling to show that the race of job applicants is information additional to other information that employers may have that they actually do act on when they respond to employees. But I would want to say a couple of things. First, I'd say, the way they put it in the experimental social science, there's the issue of, well, is this valid outside the laboratory? In other words, you have a finding. Would this finding correspond to what would happen in real life? Well, so one factor is, if I'm less likely to get a call back, sure, that's not a good thing. I'd rather have more callbacks. And it means that it may take me longer before someone calls me back. But it doesn't follow from the fact that I'm less likely to get a call back that I wouldn't eventually find a position, nor does it follow that the terms of that position would be, racially disadvantageous once I found it. And so then the question would become, well, if it's a 13% chance of getting a call back versus an 8% chance, how long does that mean that guy who gets the 8% chance has to wait longer than the guy with the 13% chance before he finds a job? And it might not be that much longer, and it might not amount to that much. I'm not trying to say there's nothing here. I'm just saying, likewise,
you got to apply for 15 jobs if you're black and 10 jobs if you're white.
Exactly. People will compensate for it precisely. If that's the nature of the world, and we know it's a tougher market out there, they'll compensate for it perhaps by searching more or whatever, and the net cost to them might not be that great. Again, I'm not trying to minimize anything. I'm just saying we don't know. Likewise, I would say that with respect to the...
Let me just push back on this for a second, because I think what you're saying is very important. But let's sort of personalize it. The kid comes to you and says, my white friend, he applies for 10 jobs and he gets called back. I got to apply for 15 jobs in order to get a call back. Screw them. Racism. I'm sick and tired of it. I'm done with this. And Glenn Loury, you say to him or her, what do you say?
Well, yeah, kid might say that, and what I say is, I feel you, brother.
Yeah, right.
I understand where you're coming from. I get it. Yeah. I know what you're saying. And it's going to be something, the speech is going to be something about how life isn't fair and how if you actually look at the bottom line, it's worth your while to put in the extra effort, so go ahead and put it in. Just like I'd never let one of these kids get away with telling me that education and skills and going to the vocational training program or getting another year of schooling or finishing the community college or getting a college degree doesn't pay if you're black, because that's just subjectively false. Mm-hmm. Perhaps what I want to say is that if one's going to extrapolate from an experimental study like Bertrand and Mullainathan to that, one's going way too far, and one's going to have to grapple with, what is apparently the case in the census and current population survey and other large population survey data, which show that people who have more years of schooling earn more, are more employable, etc., and that's true every bit as much for blacks as it is for whites. I mean, I'm not aware of any persuasive systematic evidence showing that the rate of return to schooling for blacks is lower than for whites. It's typically been the same or even higher.
Do you tell them, do you say, you say life is unfair, but also it's not just that you think that life is unfair. You think that this is a remediable unfairness. I mean, what we're talking about here is something you can do a couple of things. You can respond in three ways to this. You can say, screw this, I'm going to screw up my life because I got to apply for more jobs in order to get a call back. Doesn't seem like a really smart thing to do, although, you can sympathize with that. That's one reaction. A second thing you can say is, hey, life is unfair, you got to work, spend another hour, send out the additional job applications. It's tougher for you, but what are you going to do? Screw up your own life and prove that you can't do anything with it because there's a greater burden that you have to carry. I suppose the third thing that you can do is you could say, listen, if it's not just that life is unfair, the society is unfair, and what you should do is something to push back against that, fight against that, do something politically.
Yeah.
What about that?
Well, I'm all for it. I mean, we need to think carefully about what it might be. But I just want to add some more evidence to this discussion because Bertrand and Mullainathan are not the only people who have done studies of this kind. And the University of Chicago Press is just publishing now the book by Deva Pager, Pager, who's a professor of sociology at Princeton, a young sociologist there, called Marked, M-A-R-K-E-D, and then there's a subtitle which is basically about the effects of having a criminal record on your job prospects. Yeah. And she does this very careful, very sophisticated tester study. This is not experimental. Mullainathan and Bertrand basically made up their resumes and made up their people and sent them out electronically to employers. But what Deva Pager does is she sends people who've been carefully trained to go and apply in person for jobs at workplaces and to present essentially the same profile of background and experience, although these people will be of different races. These are men, young men who are black or white or Latino, and they will also either report that they have a criminal record, they were arrested for some crime and spent some time in jail and are now being released and looking for work, or they will report that they did not in response to the employer's query. And what she finds is that black American men who have no criminal record have essentially the same success rate being offered jobs by these employers. These are real jobs being offered to real people. They have about the same success rate of being offered jobs as do whites who are criminal offenders, who report themselves to be people who have just been released from prison and are looking for work. And the black men who acknowledge that they have criminal records have essentially no possibility of being hired. If I remember the numbers offhand, I would say them, but I don't. But those are the qualitative findings. So now what do I say to a young black man who's come out of prison and who's going from place to place trying to find work, being pressured by a probation officer to get himself gainful employment, who's being tempted by his homeboys and buddies on the other side to come back to a life of crime in this or that activity, and who's finding himself turned away at every door? I would tell him, too, to keep looking. That's the kind of rational calculation, but certainly I'd understand it if he didn't.
Yeah. I'll tell you a story. It's a personal story. I have a 21-year-old son. He's never gotten in any serious trouble, but he's come close a few times, more than a few times. And there was a point when, we were concerned about how things were going, and I got two pieces of advice. I'm going to tell you what the advice was, and then I'll tell you who gave them to me.
Yeah.
So one piece of advice was, you want to get him to quit acting stupid. I've got friends in this is in Cambridge, in the Cambridge police force. they'll come and I'll have them come over and he'll get arrested and he'll learn something from that and maybe he'll straighten up. And that was one thing.
A real arrest or mock arrest?
A real arrest. Real arrest.
Wow.
Yeah. Second advice was do whatever you can. Spare no expense. It didn't really cost it, but spare no expense in time or energy or money to keep him away from the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
Because of the problem of secondary deviance. It's the old, for want of a nail, the kingdom is lost. You get a court date, you don't show up for the court date, then there's a warrant out for your arrest, you don't show up for the warrant, you get arrested, and you've gone from doing something stupid and trivial, and suddenly you're in trouble, and then there's the probation officer, and you're not showing up for probation, and now you're really in deep shit, and then it has this permanent impact. Okay, so you won't be shy. I mean, I know people who do follow the first kind of advice. We didn't follow the first kind of advice. We followed the second kind. The first kind of advice, I should say, came from a very good friend, African-American guy, who had served some time twice. He was a talented, smart, and interesting guy, and had gotten a job and was doing okay, but he had had some legal troubles. And the other piece of advice, the one that we followed, was from a friend who was a sociologist who studied prisons. And my subsequent experience has done nothing but confirm the wisdom of her advice rather than his. But I'll tell you something. The first kind of advice came from somebody, this guy who had all the, kind of wisdom of experience on his side. I know how to get, kids to shape up and stop being stupid. And I think if we had followed the advice, it would have really been a disaster. So maybe there's a bad advice problem as well.
It could well be. It sounds like, teach them to swim by throwing them in the deep water and seeing what happens or something.
Yeah.
And it's certainly true that the deleterious effects of engagement with the system, across the board. I can see this, what you call it, secondary deviance thing going. And exactly, a lot of prison commitments now, and an important source of growth in prison commitments is from people who are being returned to prison because they failed drug tests or don't show up for appointments with their probation officers or are found, in violation of some relatively minor, they got a weapon and they shouldn't have one or something like that. They haven't used it, but they got it, and so they're back for 5 years or something. So
I know one of the things that when you were out here at Stanford about 4 months ago now and talking about the issues that were in the article and in the conversations that came up during the discussion, people were saying, okay, we sort of agree or whatever, we agree or don't agree with your analysis, but hey, Glenn, where do we go from here? What do we do about these issues about race and incarceration? What do you think about, you mentioned the importance of people in prison for drug offenses. What's your view about decriminalization of...
I favor decriminalization. I'm not an expert in all those sort of micro details of how it would work, and I know that there would have to be regulation even in a decriminalized world, in a world where people were able to come by these illicit substances without breaking the law. One would still want to have, regulations with teeth, as we have regulations of tobacco and alcohol. And decriminalization might mean one thing for marijuana, and it might mean something else for opium. The details here will matter a lot, and I'm not the most expert person to try to lay out a detailed plan, but that we have created a situation here that's not unlike the disaster of prohibition from early in the 20th century, where the harms generated by our campaign against the substance seem to significantly outweigh the harms of the substance itself. I think is demonstrable. I don't think the war on drugs has been very effective public policy. And I think that it came about for, bad, unhealthy reasons. I mean, I think we were, as a society, afraid about the potential of drugs to do damage to, the young generation of Americans. And so we wanted to, strike out against this. But we've criminalized, basically, we've criminalized a medical condition here. I mean, I think drug addiction is a health problem, and we've become so punitive now that we're filling up spaces with people, we're ruining people's lives, and we're not really impeding impeding the consumption of narcotics. Now, I know, people have different views about this, and some supporters of the drug control regime will say that, well, it's harder for, you have to go out of your way to find it. It's not like you can walk around to the corner stores. But the price of cocaine or heroin or methamphetamines on the streets of American cities have been pretty much steadily falling for a good 20 years. The ability to come by marijuana in Harvard Square or Coolidge Corner over Brookline near where I live, I mean, it's trivial. It's there. The statistics suggest that marijuana consumption at the Brookline High School, comparable American high schools, is really quite high. I mean, 40-50% of the kids might report that in the last year they would have used. We're not winning the war on drugs. In fact, it's probably a wrong way of thinking about it. We're underinvesting in treatment. I'm just now talking about drug policy.
Yes.
And overinvesting in punishment. More generally, I think our sentences are too long. Yeah. I think we've moved too far in the direction of taking discretion away from judges. I think three strikes laws are really very bad public policy, and I think that, again, is demonstrable. Create bad incentives and use prison space inefficiently. You've got now someone 3 strikes, they're in prison for 25 to life for having committed to 3 offenses. They go past their 40th, their 45th, their 50th birthdays, and we're still locking them up, even though by all indications the likelihood of criminal offending declines very rapidly as you move through those years. So now you've got prison space allocated.
What would it take to move this on the political agenda?
Yeah.
I mean, that's maybe the $64,000 question. Maybe that's a segue into a question about the presidential race, but maybe that's the wrong level at which to think about it. I mean, how could... I guess I'm inclined to agree with you about that. I mean, I think in particular marijuana laws are just off the wall. But what would it take? I mean, who could do it? How does it happen? I mean, if you...
This is an important question, yeah. I mean, and one can speculate about it. I'm not sure that I know. I mean, I think the sheer expense at the state level of business as usual is definitely beginning to register with governors and state legislatures. And they are beginning to talk in the various states about modifications. So, for example, the phenomenon of the drug court. California has passed an initiative that mandates that nonviolent first or second time drug offenders be referred to treatment rather than incarceration as the primary way of dealing with them. We're seeing other such things. So, just kind of doing the sums. I mean, right, we got to give health care to this aging prison population. It's costing a fortune. Maybe the taxpayers want to rethink reliance on prison when the bills come due. But I don't find that to be the most promising sign that change might come, because it's, the people will respond to that in a piecemeal way. Yeah. One of the ways you're going to save money is by reducing the services that you provide to inmates, trying to go to a bare-bone response to the problem, looking for ways of economizing, relying on private imprisonment, shipping them out of state to make use of excess capacity other places in the country. There's a lot of things you can do to save money without thinking about serious reform of the system. So I think for change to come, there really, it has to be a change at the level of ideas, at the level of kind of how we're thinking about this, and some undoing or walking back from this, the labels are easy to come by. I'm going to call it a neoconservative kind of rethinking of our punishment policy. I mean, I think of figures like the very distinguished political scientist James Q. Wilson, who was at Harvard for many years and has been in Southern California, I think at UCLA or something since. But in any case, these guys, I mean, and there were others. There was an article in the Public Interest magazine from the early 1970s that declared that, mid-1970s, that rehabilitation didn't work, and that started a whole debate about whether or not it was futile, liberal poppycock to think that you could do anything with criminals other than confine them. The whole zero tolerance business, the broken windows theory, the sort of upsurge of thinking that if we just clamp down on every offense, if we stop and frisk at every opportunity, et cetera, we can eliminate the crime problem. I don't mean to be dismissing these ideas with the back of my hand, but I mean to say that there's a kind of mentality, there's a kind of set of ideas, an ideology, if you will, that grew up in the 1970s and 80s and really took root in the 1990s, and not only in this country, about punishment. And it seems to me that that's the thing that ultimately has to be taken on. That,
there's an old idea in Jeremy Bentham, the great utilitarian and legal thinker and designer of prisons, and there's a line that it's a very important point that he makes in his introduction to the principles of morals and legislation. He says, punishment in itself is an evil. Now, Bentham he didn't have any problem with people going to jail.
Yeah, right? I get it.
You got to judge.
But he just wants us to do
the bad thing. It's not something to celebrate.
Right. Let's get the cost right. Get the signs right on all our numbers, so when we add up the costs and the benefits, we know what we're talking about.
Right. So this is a bad. When he said an evil, what he meant is it's painful. It's painful for people who are in prison. It's painful for their families. Potential loss to the society as a whole. So this is a negative sign. And I think when you say a change in ideas, I think when we talk about punitiveness and ideas about people deserving to be punished, there's been a kind of perception that it's a good thing for somebody to get punished if they did something bad, rather than thinking this is a bad thing, this is pain, this is a cost, and now let's see if there's a good justification for it.
Well, so the devil's advocate thing here, the other side of that would be, well, it is a good thing, a person might say. I mean, when we punish, first of all, we deter future offending. That's a value.
Yeah.
Secondly, we stand for righteousness, and we stand with the victim and against the criminal, and that's morally important. That's the right message to send, people might say. There was a reason why, when they'd have these public executions back in the days of lynching and vigilante justice, that people would come out in droves, and they would bring picnic baskets, and they'd sometimes bring their children to these affairs. And there's a reason why many people insist that capital punishment, which of course extracts the ultimate price from the person to whom it's administered, is nevertheless a good thing to do, because people might say, quite apart from deterring criminals and getting justice, it sends the right message. It's, we've executed. It's the ultimate punishment. We're reaffirming the norms that hold our community together, something like that.
Yeah.
So now, that might sound like a whole lot of sociological, theoretical, nonsense, but I think there's something real in it. And I think the politician instinctively knows this. When, I remember that gubernatorial race in Virginia. It's been a few years ago now. But the Republican candidate, I hope I don't swear to somebody because I don't remember the politician's name. But anyway, the thing that I want to say is, it was a question of whether or not the Democrat, who had declared himself morally opposed to the death penalty, could be trusted to administer it under Virginia law were he to be elected to governor. And he had asserted that he would, and the Republican opponent said he couldn't be trusted to actually do it, and brought on a victim, that is, the survivor of someone who had been murdered, to tell the camera and the viewing public that that's a Democratic person who didn't like capital punishment. She didn't believe that he could be trusted to actually pull the switch on someone like the person who had deprived her of, her husband or her father or whatever it might be. And, I'm thinking, why do politics like that work? Why isn't that just patently and obviously illegitimate and crude and disqualifying for a candidate to put a commercial like that up and then show up at the end of the day and say, my name is so-and-so and I approve this message? Well, it seems to me the reason that it works is because there's a demand out there in the public for vengeance. There's a demand for blood. There's a sense of, this is a performance. There's a dramatic aspect to what we do when we punish.
It reminds me of what happened when Mike Dukakis was asked the question in the 1988 debate about how he would respond if his wife were raped.
Right.
And he said, blah, 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 and he gave a little speech. And instead of saying what he could have said, which was, somebody did that, I'd want to strangle him. And
I want to do it myself.
And I would try to do it. But the reason that we have a criminal justice system rather than a system of private vengeance is because along the way to doing that, maybe I'd get the wrong guy. Maybe I would, find somebody who looked like the reason we have a system of criminal justice rather than a system of private vengeance is partly so you avoid the mistake of the mistakes of punishing people who are innocent. And I think this is, maybe I'm just agreeing with you here about the need for a kind of public discussion that's very hard to have, but probably is really needed in this case, which is to talk about the difference between private vengeance and a system of criminal justice, and what the values of fairness are, and why you want jurors, to go back to our earlier discussion, why you want juries who come to the case with their life experiences and have their biases, but they can make a conscientious effort to put those aside in the course of sorry, I'm having some trouble here with my earpiece. To make decisions on the basis of the evidence, and with a presumption of innocence, and with an acknowledgement that there are both individual and social costs to adopting this huge individual and social costs to adopting this punitive strategy. Maybe the thing to do, this is maybe a place to bring things around in terms of time in this discussion, but it goes back to something that you said along the way in this conversation, which is, whatever you think the right way of addressing the crime and punishment issue is, I think there's pretty wide agreement that the way we've been doing it is not working. It's a international humiliation that we are by far and away the most incarcerated, if that's the right word here, the most incarcerated society in the world, that there are lots of people who are in prison for non-violent offenses, that there is a racial bias in this, and that we ought to be having a conversation building on things like your article about what to do about this. Seems to me there are basically, I think in terms of domestic American politics and policy, there really are three big issues. One is this issue about incarceration. The second, obviously not unrelated issue, is the issue about concentrated inner city poverty. Yeah. And the third is the issue about health care. Lots of other stuff too, but those, and when we're not going to talk about the presidential race today because we're out of time. But
but let me just say one thing, Josh. Ahead. I think I agree with you about the issues, these important domestic issues. But I was going to say, I think there's a kind of transcendent thing that's going here, and it has to do with who are we as a people, we Americans, and what do we stand for? Now we got an army marching around the world with a banner that's waving over it that has freedom written on that banner. And the president, and again, I don't want to make this partisan, because whoever president is going to stand up and make speeches not all that dissimilar from that. Yeah. They're going to invoke these values, and they're going to talk about our society, and they're going to say we're a leader of the world and we're a great and wonderful people. And yet we have such unfreedom among us. The scale of it, and the disparity by race and class. Now, all of that is consistent. All of that can be made to work only if we can have this argument that says these individuals did this thing, and what we do to them they earned and deserve on the basis of what they did. And so what we do to them, and systematically how we do it, in the industrial quality of how we're doing it, and the scope and scale of how we're doing it, and the disparity of how we're doing it, is all legitimate and consistent with our self-image as a free people, a leader of the world, a beacon of hope, a city on the hill, and so forth. Now, I just don't think that can stand the light of day, that there's a profound inconsistency there, that there's like a deep hypocrisy built right into the core of America's public presentation to the world. And I think people around the world can see it. It's not the only issue on which we exhibit that hypocrisy, but since that's the one that we're talking about and we're out of time.
I'm going to give you, it's a powerful statement that I'm going to give you the last word on it. Very good to talk to you, Glenn.
Same here, Josh. And Josh, I got to just thank you personally for making my article so much smarter than it was before you edited it. Thank you.
Just make sure you said everything you wanted to say.
Yeah, I didn't know some of the stuff I wanted to say, but I'm glad I said it.
Good. Okay. Good talk. All right. Bye-bye.